Hello, and thank you for joining the podcast Emergency Minute. Your host is an emergency medicine physician who brings over 20 years of experience in healthcare. Dr. Parente will take you through some of the trending topics and challenges faced in the ER and all of healthcare. Join in the fight against misinformation. And don't forget to follow on social media at Dr. J. Parente. Now, here's your host, Dr. John Parente.
All right, welcome back everyone to Emergency Minute. I am your host, Dr. John Parente, coming to you today, episode number 24, Medical Billing Sucks. Yeah, that's actually the name of the episode. We're going to get down into the weeds a little bit on why there are so many misconceptions about how this works. I want to thank everyone for tuning into the last show, ER versus Urgent Care. Don't forget to follow me on social media. You guys know how much I need the love. Please consider leaving a review or share this episode with someone that you think likes to bitch about healthcare and especially billing. I'm sure you guys have people in your lives that love to just sit around and bitch about the cost of things. So today's episode is perfect for them. Send them a gift. I also want to let you know I did a podcast with Dr. Dustin Portella, one of my favorite human beings on earth. I will link it in the show. You just want to go on Apple and check out the Dr. Dustin podcast with Dr. Dustin Portella. We talk about everything from emergency medicine being the sort of safety net for the United States. We talk about crossover with dermatology since that's what he does. And it was just a great discussion. We actually talked a little bit about manscaping, which is pretty hilarious. We talked about just about everything. So check that out. I'll link it in the show for today. And always don't forget to let me know what other topics you want me to cover. I got a lot of feedback on that ER versus urgent care. So that was great to see. You guys can always reach out to me on social media at Dr. J. Parente on just about any social media platform. All right, here's my disclaimer. I am not an expert in medical billing. I am not going to get into crazy fine detail. I'm sure there's some nerds out there somewhere that want to get into the weeds on this. I'm just going to kind of give you sort of the bird's eye view on how complex this is and, kind of give you a little bit of background. I started a company back in 2008 where we ran the emergency room. So I had to have some intimate knowledge of medical billing as it pertained to my company so we could survive. So this really is going to pertain mostly to emergency medicine, but obviously there are a lot of parallels with the rest of healthcare that you can draw. And we're going to talk about how messed up medical billing is today and then what we can do about it, which is pretty much nothing. So, all right, buckle up. So how does billing work? Billing is two different things when you go to the emergency room, and a lot of times people don't understand that. You get two charges. You get what's called the facility charge, which is your cost for going to that hospital, and that's through the hospital. Then there's a secondary fee that is the physician fee, and that's obviously how we get paid as physicians. Now, just to give you some idea of like what that looks like, a facility charge is usually around $1,500 for an ER visit versus the doctor charge, which is roughly $500. Now, that sounds astronomically high, but the reason why is because of the $500 we charge, we would be lucky to collect 28% of that bill, which is not a lot. So you have to understand that the way healthcare billing goes is that you charge way more than what you're actually going to get because you're not actually going to get that amount back, if that makes sense. So like this is completely asinine. So if you went to McDonald's, right, and it's like $10 for a meal, I don't know what McDonald's meals are these days, but it seems like everything is going up and up and up. So if you had a $10 meal and they only collected 28% on that meal, then that means McDonald's would only get $2.80. And by the way, that's not right away. That's sometime in like a 30 to 365 day window while this is all sorted out with paperwork and insurance companies and people fighting their insurance companies and the insurance companies fighting them and them fighting the hospital. And what would happen if that happened? All this stuff gets sent to collectors or basically just goes unpaid. McDonald's would not be profitable. They would close or they would raise the shit out of their prices. It's not that simple in healthcare. We can't just raise prices. And we'll talk a little bit more about price transparency later in the show. I think that would obviously be a very good thing, but how do you do it? So let's talk about the insurance companies and how everything's based on this Medicare formula. So Medicare formula has been around forever. It is highly flawed. It is a mathematical nightmare that no one really truly understands other than we just know what the fee is and is it going up or down. Everything is based off of that. It sets the bar, so to speak, for how insurance companies are going to pay back various vendors. Okay, so for example, when you come to the emergency department, let's say you have United Healthcare Insurance. United Healthcare Insurance, we would have a deal with them that basically says we would get 130% of Medicare, meaning if Medicare pays, $100, then United Healthcare would actually pay $130. And there are some that are above Medicare, most of them are. And then there are some that are below Medicare, far below Medicare, things like Medicaid. And then, of course, you have your self-pay and things like that, which every hospital handles a little differently. Most hospitals, to be honest, they don't even bill some of these people because they know they're not going to get anything. And it's really not even worth the paperwork to send out. So that is all how this formula works. Now, when they cut this obviously creates a huge problem. This impacts physicians, it impacts reimbursement, it impacts healthcare, it impacts even the hospitals. This is not good for healthcare. Now, I know, okay, so you can't just keep pumping money in and raising it every year. Well, trust me, they're not raising it every year, although the population is getting older and growing, of course. But a real life example of how this is a bad thing is when you cut the Medicare formula, which has happened the last several years, physician reimbursement is going to go down. And that's what's happening. Friends are out there getting raises and they're, doing things and they're in business world and that kind of stuff. And, all this inflation, everything's costing more. Well, physician salaries are very stagnant or actually dropping. And so what happened for the first time these last 2 years, for a real life example of why this is a bad thing, is that ER residencies went unfilled. Now, ER was typically a very competitive medical field because what you want to do is you get in, you make a good living, you get to help people, kind of adrenaline junkies are in there, and then you go home. You don't have to take your work home with you per se. So it's very competitive, very hard to get into emergency medicine, which means we got some of the brightest people out there, some of the hardest working people out there into these residency programs. What's happened these last 2 years are record numbers of openings, meaning they're not filling these spots. And then if they have to, because they have all these spots that are funded, then they're getting sort of the bottom of the barrel people. And they're like, well, I guess if nobody else can work this spot. So what happens is the quality of the candidate drops tremendously. And this is happening across healthcare. This is happening not just in emergency medicine, but when these cuts happen, this is not good. And I'm trying to explain this to people. And that's what the purpose of today's show is. And you guys know I'm very active on social media. One of the things that I see all the time are these social media nurses that are just blasting hospitals and CEOs all the time. And oh my God, they make all this money and they're not giving it to the nurses, and the nurses deserve so much more money and this and that. Look, I agree. Nurses are tremendously important to the healthcare system. They are the backbone of the healthcare system. No one wants to be told that they're not worth more money. We all want more money. We all want to make more money and work not quite as hard as we are today, right? I mean, that's the goal. I'm not suggesting that. However, the blame is placed at the feet of the wrong person. Hospitals are making all-time lows in margin. Margins are the narrowest they've ever been in our entire lifetimes. Yeah, back in the day, hospitals had crazy margins, 12%, 20%. Things like this did exist way back in the day. Those days are done. Now, I'm not saying there aren't hospital systems out there, big systems, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, things like that. I have no idea how much money those guys are actually making, these giant companies. But I will tell you, the average hospital out there, if you're driving down the road and you pull into a hospital, that hospital is struggling to stay open. And how do we know this? Well, first of all, I sit on the medical executive committee for the last 20 years of every hospital I've been at. I see these things. I see the books. I know exactly what's happening. And, revenues are at an all-time low when it comes to this because of what's happening with all the CMS cuts and funding. And yeah, I mean, to the rest of the world, like everything's going up, right? You go out to the store and you get 5 groceries and, try to make dinner for your family and it's like $50. Like everything's going up, including, by the way, nursing salaries. Nursing salaries have skyrocketed for the last decade. There are costs to this, but I'm telling you, the hospital CEOs and the hospitals, the average community hospital, are not the ones that should be shouldering this blame. And I see this all the time on social media. It drives me crazy. And that's not to say we can't do things better. We're certainly far from perfect. You guys hear me say this all the time. Healthcare is disaster right now. It's absolutely a disaster. But these hospitals are closing. They're being absorbed by bigger hospital systems that do have enough margin left to somewhat, mitigate that loss from that other hospital. And it's a nightmare. But I want to let you guys know that it's not this hospital that you should be upset with. It's the insurance companies. And let's talk about that. The insurance companies, United Healthcare announced a revenue of $100 billion for this past quarter with $9 billion in profit. They're projecting $400 billion in revenue this year with nearly $40 billion in profit. Well, who do you think they're making that money on? They're making the money on the backs of the patients, on the backs of the doctors, the nurses, and the healthcare system. They got plenty of margin. But how do you stop this? And we'll get into that a little bit later, but these are the people that we should be upset with, not Joe Schmo, the little hospital and the little hospital CEO that really doesn't impact that and doesn't really have that much control over what they're paying nurses and that kind of stuff that people think often that they do. Another thing I wanted to touch on really quickly, and I'm not going to get into this too much, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about inpatient versus OBS and how Medicare reimburses this. This is a broken system. This is absolutely a nightmare. And if you come into the hospital, there are certain criteria that you have to meet in order to basically either qualify as inpatient or qualify as OBS. And you could do an entire podcast. You could write an entire book on, how do you do both of those things. One thing I want to make clear to the American public is that doctors and nurses, we don't decide if you are inpatient or OBS. It's not something I can check a box and say, make this patient inpatient or make this patient OBS or anything like that. We have no control over it. It's based on different things, your vital signs and labs. And if you have a certain lab, then you meet inpatient criteria. But if your lab's not bad enough, then you're only considered OBS. And at the end of the day, everybody wants to be inpatient because Medicare and most insurance companies will pay for it almost in full or to the max of whatever plan they have. But if you're put in an observation status, which again, ding, 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 is not my decision, it's just something that is there, then you are sometimes saddled with this huge bill. And it's absolutely asinine how this works. And what happens is it leads to bad outcomes. It's totally unfair. I have patients almost every day that say to me, well, am I going to be inpatient or OBS? And I'm like, well, honestly, I don't know, based on all these criteria, we don't know. We're not involved in this kind of stuff. And they're like, well, if I'm going to be an OBS, I'm not staying in the hospital, so I'm just going to leave. So you have patients who really should be in the hospital. They need to have IV antibiotics, they need breathing treatments, they need oxygen, whatever they need. And they're like, no, I can't afford some $10,000 bill. I have to go home. Maybe they'll get worse and then they'll qualify for inpatient. It's absolutely a disaster, but I want to make sure people understand that it's not a decision that the physician makes. It's something that is based on all these criteria that no one understands and yet somehow literally dictates how the financial transaction occurs in healthcare, which is a complete joke. So how do we fix this? Well, everyone will scream from the rooftop, single payer system. There are tons of flaws with this idea, proven around the world, red flags everywhere. The government can't get out of their own way, that we're sending planes full of money to foreign countries. You ever been to the BMV? One of the worst run organizations on earth. I don't think single payer system works. There are people out there that do believe that. That's fine. I don't think it's ever going to happen. The other solution would be, could you have some price transparency? I think this would be a great thing. I mean, where else on earth do you see something where you don't know what the hell you're paying for it? Could you imagine going and buying a car and not knowing what the cost was, or food, or you can make that application to just about anything in the world. Go to a plastic surgeon's office and ask for whatever procedure you want. I guarantee you they will tell you what the price is. Of course, that's not covered by insurance and that's in a cash-based system. So here's what I think needs to happen. I don't think it will, but I think this is what needs to happen. And understand, I'm not a big regulations guy. I'm more, government is here to protect me, give me basic law and order and infrastructure to function in my day-to-day tasks. But I pretty much want the government to stay out of my way and let me do what I want to do. I mean, that's what this country was founded on. We've gotten away from that, but I digress. But I think the only way that this gets fixed is if the insurance companies get regulated by Washington. Now, here's why I don't think that will happen, because the people who regulate them would be the idiots in Washington. So guess who lobbies and AKA pays for these congressmen and congresswomen and their campaigns and their special interest groups? Bingo, the insurance companies. So the only people that can really fix this are Congress, but they're not really motivated to do so, because as long as the sort of machine keeps running, then they can keep getting their money from the insurance companies and their lobbyists and their special interests. And they can say things like they want to, fight for this and the American people and raise their fist in the air. But at the end of the day, that's really the only thing that's going to impact these insurance companies, because they've become too big, too powerful. They basically have a monopoly on this entire situation. So what happens, let's go back to our example. What happens when CMS, which is Medicare, Medicaid, aka the government, what happens when they lower their reimbursement like they have done for the last 2 years? So in our example of a $500 charge, now keep in mind, this is just for the physician charge. In this scenario, we would collect $140. Well, over the last 3 years, that reimbursement from CMS has dropped 10%. So that means instead of collecting $140 from each patient, now we're collecting $126. So who gets the money? Who keeps their money in this scenario? The insurance companies, right? Like I'm getting 120, I'm not getting 126. I wish I was getting 126, but 126 goes for the physician fee instead of 140. Well, where's that extra $14 go? It goes in the pockets of the insurance companies. So what that means is that when CMS lowers their formula, the insurance companies win because they reimburse less. And what happens is CMS will change that formula, and then all of the insurance companies will follow suit. And this is just how it works. This is how it's always worked. And this is just what happens. So every time CMS lowers this, the insurance companies become more profitable. So what do you think the insurance companies are then going to do? They're going to do everything in their power to make sure that the people in Washington are taken care of financially, such that these numbers don't ever get fixed. So who loses money then? Who pays for that extra $14 in that example? Well, either the doctor doesn't get it or it falls on the patient, right? And that's not fair either. These patients that have real life emergencies and real life problems that need to come to the hospital to get cared for, and they're getting saddled with all this extra money so that the insurance companies can give more to their executives and their shareholders. It's an absolutely broken system. So this is called the physician fee schedule. Now listen to this. It dropped 3.4% in 2023. It dropped 2.93% in 2024. And there's another cut proposed, 2.8% for 2025. And if you take into account inflation, which I don't know if you've been paying attention, but was recently historically high, with all of these cuts, the average ER physician has lost 29% over the last 10 years. I wonder why all those ER residencies are going unfilled. So is anything in your life going down right now, as far as cost? I mean, this impacts everyone. And unfortunately, it's impacting the quality of healthcare. Now, another piece of the puzzle here that we could talk about would be prior authorizations. Now, thank God I don't have to deal with this in the emergency room. We just order whatever test is needed and, try to save the patient's life, treat the patient, etc. But this is a huge deal in the outpatient world when other physicians are trying to get tests that are needed for their patients, but they have to get prior authorization. Prior authorization is just a really fancy word for, guess what? We're not going to let you order that test unless someone on our end thinks that patient needs it. Basically, it is practicing medicine without a license. And what's crazy is these prior authorizations and these denials are often performed by either algorithms or AI or nurses or people that aren't even physicians. The average denial is either Aetna or Cigna. Don't quote me on the actual company. I mean, they're all different flavors of the devil. But the average denial was less than 1 second. So what that means is if they have like 50,000 prior authorizations, they can go through these things and deny them in less than 1 second based on some sort of algorithm that shows that this patient doesn't need the MRI or this patient doesn't need their CAT scan. And then, by the way, what happens to that patient? Well, either A, they don't get the test that they need, which is bullshit, or B, they have to pay for the test, which some people have the ability to do that. It's unfair, but if they need it, they're willing to pay for it. Okay. Or they go to the emergency room and sometimes they get worse, or they come to the ER and just get the damn test. And then we are saddled in the ER with all this extraneous stuff that's not necessarily an emergency, but still obviously is involved with healthcare. So prior authorizations and denials is a huge problem, but we don't really see a whole lot of it in the ER other than those patients that did get denied and end up coming into the hospital. How did we get here? How did we get to a point where we're saying the doctor has ordered this test, but the person sitting behind a computer 1,000 miles away that knows nothing about anyone is saying that we're not going to pay for it because we don't think that patient needs it? That's where we're at. That's where we're at right now. And you guys hear me say this all the time. Healthcare is broken. And I hear people say this all the time. Oh, healthcare is bursting at the seams. One day it's going to break. Bullshit. It's already broken. I could tell you stories that would blow your mind. And many of you guys know this if you've had to utilize healthcare recently. But I love my job, sort of. Or at least I need the money to pay the bills and keep my family afloat and keep moving forward. So I cannot tell these stories, but I will tell you that someday if I, ever win the Powerball, I would love to tell these stories because I think the average person in this country doesn't realize how broken health care is. So I don't know that we really have anywhere to go from here. I mean, what choices do we have? Are we going to take on the insurance company? Good luck. I suggest and encourage you to continue to fight with them for every single penny. I know it's a total pain in the rear end, and I know they really don't have any checks and balances, right? Like, hey, my doctor says I need this test, but you guys keep denying it, and you got to call them, and why? And they just hang up. We'll put you in our appeal process. Well, what the hell does that look like? Who's in charge of that? Whoever comes to the insurance company and says, hey guys, this is bullshit. This patient really needs this. Unless you have a physician advocate fighting for you, and even then, you sometimes are going to lose that battle. So I encourage you to fight against the insurance companies, but I don't know how else you can fight with these guys unless they're regulated by Washington. I guess you could start up your own insurance company to compete with the big ones, but I'm pretty sure that they have a monopoly on this system. They have measures built in for their security with their partnerships in Washington. So I really don't know where to go from here other than you're going to have to hopefully have somebody in healthcare that can guide you and at least try to get the care, that you need in the most financially responsible way. But that is a very jagged path to take, unfortunately. Speaking of telling stories, I did start telling some stories on social media, specifically YouTube, so be sure to check that out. I'm asking for feedback. I was asking, do people want to hear something funny? Do people want to hear something gruesome? Some of the gore stuff that I've seen, the sad stuff. So I started sort of a different channel on YouTube that has lots of different cases where I start discussing cases that are either really funny or really sad. So be sure to check that out and share that with a loved one. All right, so have a happy Halloween. This year I'm going to go as a very disgruntled Browns fan, so I won't even need a costume. Go Cavs, go Buckeyes, and go anyone who's playing the Yankees or the Steelers. Love you guys. Peace, love, and happiness to everyone out there.
Thanks for joining us this week on Emergency Minute. Join us next time for more hard-hitting discussions on some of today's issues in healthcare. Don't forget to leave us a review on Spotify or follow on social media at Dr. J. Parente.